Good morning, friends. Happy Sunday. I hope you're doing well. And welcome to Piccadilly Circus. You'll recognise it, I'm sure. Piccadilly Circus is a busy place where roads collide, where advertisers advertise, famous also for the advertising hoardings that now are so bright they almost blind you. Piccadilly Circus, a busy and a bustling place. But the reason I'm here is mainly because of the fountain you can see behind me. Built in 1893, it has at the top of it thought to be Eros. In fact, it isn't Eros. We'll come back to that a little later. A fountain erected in 1893 to remember a wonderful man, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. Shaftesbury was a man who very much took up what Wilberforce before him had started. Wilberforce, of course, the great abolitionist who was in charge of the movement that got slavery abolished. And then the Earl of Shaftesbury, 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, came that little bit later, and his great concern was to champion the cause of the poor. He rallied in Parliament all manner of acts to particularly protect children and to particularly protect the vulnerable, women and so forth, who were working in factories, working at very young ages. And the Earl of Shaftesbury was the one who decided to use his power and his influence to bring about profound social change. And so they erected this statue of him in 1893. Interesting, isn't it? In the middle of this busy place, less busy today, of course, because we're still in our second lockdown, but in the midst of this busy place, there is a statue commemorating the life of a man who essentially lived a very humble life, using his power to bring blessing to those who don't have power. The Christian story is profoundly a story about one who is powerful, ultimately powerful, choosing to let go of his power so that he may bless the world. That is what is happening as Jesus comes and Jesus dies. He's coming to bring his power to bless the world. So easy to miss such a thing. A bit like here in the middle of what is usually a bustly place. Quite easy in one sense just to walk past the fountain. There it sits in the middle of this bustly place, in the middle of this powerful place with all these advertising hoardings. Here there is a record, if you like, of a man who used his power to bring those without power out of poverty. The God I worship is the God who doesn't choose to flex his muscles, beat us up around the head, so to speak, but he is a God who often comes to us in the quietest and most gentle ways. And as I was thinking about this idea of powerlessness in the midst of power, my mind turned to 1 Kings 19. It's a story of Elijah. He's coming to the end of his ministry, his time as a prophet with God, and he's pretty disheartened. He finds himself on his own, essentially complaining before God because God isn't being powerful enough. God isn't doing what God should do. And he finds himself complaining to God. And in the midst of that, we find this wonderful scene where God appears to Elijah, but not in the way he imagined. So I'm going to read some verses from 1 Kings 19, verse 11 to verse 13. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." And a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a still, small voice. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Not in the earthquake, not in the wind, not in the fire, but in the still, small voice. It's interesting, hasn't it, this year? We've had to slow down. We've had to. We've been forced to. Things have been taken from us. We've been locked up, so to speak. Could that be God speaking to us in that quietness, saying, stop all the busyness, all the rushing around, and find me in the still small voice, the quiet whisper. Interesting, isn't it, with Jesus? He comes to Jerusalem on a donkey, meek and mild, not a war horse, not a king with great banners, but people with palm branches. He lives a humble life. And of course, we're going to be remembering very soon, he comes to a tin pot sort of a place, Bethlehem. Nobody really ever expected much to come out of Bethlehem. One might imagine a small village somewhere, perhaps in the far tips of Cornwall, or who knows, up north, but somewhere that nobody had ever really expected much to happen in. And yet Jesus, as we shall celebrate soon, comes in Bethlehem. And not, of course, in a great palace, but in a stable. The busyness of the world churning, and Christ comes in that strange otherness, that still small voice. I love the story of Jesus when he goes to Mary and Martha's house. There's Martha, frantically busy, getting everything ready because they've got an important guest. And there's Mary sitting at Christ's feet. And Jesus says to Martha, Mary has chosen what is best, and it will not be taken from her. And I think what he means is, look, there's always going to be busyness, there's always going to be things to do. But the one thing that is needed is to sit at the feet of the Lord. And I guess that's what Elijah had to learn as well. He wanted the Lord in the power, the earthquake, the wind, the fire. But what he got was the Lord in a still, small voice. I wonder how that speaks to you this morning. I wonder how you've been finding this year. Deeply frustrating? Well, no doubt at times, because it has been. But also, is there not an opportunity here? Is not God speaking to us in this relative stillness, this relative quiet? Well, I suspect he is. I sense he is, certainly to me. I am in this, he says to us, but not in the way you might have imagined. C.S. Lewis, such a brilliant man, said this about the story of Christianity. He said, Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed. You might say landed in disguise, and is calling us to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. I love that idea of God landing in disguise. That, of course, is true. He doesn't come as we expect, but he has come. And Advent is the season when we get ready for that extraordinary coming of God to us. Friends, God is not far off as you imagine. God is much closer to you than you realise, and I realise. But so often we're just rushing about, getting on with our agendas and our things, and we miss God. And that's a real tragedy. In fact, an eternal tragedy. There's another way we might miss God, and it brings me back to this marvellous statue. As I said earlier, many people think that the figure on the top, the figure of the angel, is Eros, the god of love, but actually it's Antiros, his brother. And Antiros was the god of selfless love. But actually, I think in a way, this statue misunderstands the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was a devout believer, a devout Christian. The idea that he might want a statue of a Greek god, I suspect he would scratch his head and wonder. I've said already, it's possible to miss God in all the busyness and the power that we think God will be in, and he's not. But it's also possible to miss God because we misunderstand how God comes to us. We think we know, oh, I know, that's the statue of Eros. We all know that, but it isn't. It isn't. We have the wrong view, and God needs to change that view. We have the wrong understanding. So whether you miss God in the busyness, or you miss God because you think you understand, oh, I know all about God, say people, but in fact you've missed it entirely. I don't know where that speaks to you this morning in terms of how you're going with God. I want to say, whether you're missing God in busyness or missing God because you think you understand but you don't, I want to say come back to the Word of God. It's been fascinating on Wednesday nights as we've looked at Mark's Gospel together. We've seen all sorts of things and eyes have popped as people have said, really? Is that really how it is? How Jesus is? How God is? And the answer is yes, it is. Because this is the record we have, the foundation document of our faith. It reminds me of a time when I was a divorce solicitor. And I'd been advising clients, as we all had, about how the courts would divide up money on divorce, particularly in so-called big money cases. There was a presumption that the husbands would keep 2/3 and the wife would get 1/3, and that was just the presumption, and that's what we were advising husbands and wives. And then in 2000, along came a case called White v. White, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the justices went back to the Matrimonial Causes Act. And they said, where in this act does it say that wives should get 1/3 and husbands 2/3? And everyone scratched their heads and said, it doesn't say it in this act at all. And so that was the first and landmark case when the judges said, actually, wives should get half and husbands should get half. And for many years, decades, lawyers had been getting it wrong. The courts had been getting it wrong. Friends, so often in the Christian faith, there are those who've been getting it wrong, who need to come back to the source material and ask themselves, well, where does it say that? Or to find new things out about the God who has made them and who loves them. And so here we are, Piccadilly Circus, a busy place, a crossroads, a place of power with those advertising hoardings beaming down at us, but also a place where this marvellous statue has been erected. Marvellous because it remembers this man, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, a man who dedicated his power to bless those who had none. And of course, as I've said, I'm here also because Jesus is a man who dedicated his power, his extreme power, to use to bless the world. Christmas is the coming of God in powerlessness as a baby, in a stable, in a manger, in Bethlehem, of all places. Friends, this is the story you need. This is the story you need to inhabit. This is the one who has come for you and for me. This is the one who will turn your life upside down, but bless you beyond your wildest dreams. Friends, this is Jesus, and this is the one who says, don't be too busy, don't misunderstand me, but come, live with me, for I have come to live with you. May God bless you richly this Sunday.